"Is Ivanka your mom?" The words dropped into the chamber like a grenade, echoing louder than the gavel, louder than the cameras clicking, louder than even the gasps that ripped through the crowd. For a split second, time seemed to stall. Barron Trump, so sure of his footing only moments earlier, blinked as if the question itself had shattered the glass shield of privilege he had carried into the room. His lips parted, but no answer came. His face stiffened, then flushed, as the murmurs swelled into a chorus of disbelief that wrapped around him like a storm. In the front row, aides shifted uncomfortably. Journalists, their fingers frozen mid-typing, exchanged wide-eyed glances. A ripple of stifled laughter rose from the back benches, quickly hushed, but not before it had punctured the tension with the sharp edge of ridicule. Everyone knew they were witnessing a moment, one that would escape the confines of that hall and explode. Across every phone screen in America, within minutes, the camera lenses zoomed in, desperate to capture the tiny twitch in Barron's jaw, the flicker of panic in his eyes. For years, he had been insulated from hard questions, his name carried by dynasty, his youth shielded by a carefully curated aura of untouchability. But here, stripped of that protection, the son of a former president was just another figure standing exposed under the glare of a question too sharp, too personal, too precise to ignore. And across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Her voice had been calm, steady, not cruel, not mocking, simply surgical. She had asked the unaskable, and in doing so, she had shifted the balance of power in the room. What Barron thought was his stage had, in an instant, become hers. The weight of that silence that followed was unbearable, the kind that presses down on every chest, demanding someone, anyone, to breathe first. But Jasmine held it. She let the silence work for her, and the longer it stretched, the more devastating it became. What happened in those next few seconds became the clip no one could stop replaying. It wasn't just a question. It was a strike at arrogance, a dismantling of entitlement. But to understand why this one question carried such devastating weight, we need to step back. The setting had all the grandeur of political theater. Heavy wooden desks, flags hanging solemnly overhead, the sharp hum of cameras feeding live broadcasts into millions of homes. This wasn't just another committee room. It was a crucible where reputations could be forged or incinerated in the span of a sentence. And into that crucible walked Barron Trump, chin tilted just slightly higher than the rest, shoulders squared with the confidence of someone who had never once doubted that the spotlight belonged to him. It wasn't earned confidence. It wasn't born of struggle or long nights preparing policy. It was inherited, like a trust fund or a gilded penthouse. To Barron, the chamber wasn't an intimidating arena. It was an extension of the empire he had grown up in. Every marble column whispered the name Trump, and in his mind, that was enough to command deference. He didn't have to prove anything. His surname had already done the heavy lifting, but beneath that polished entitlement lurked something dangerous. The arrogance of underestimation. Barron believed this would be an easy showing, another stage where he could flex his last name like a weapon and coast on its weight. What he failed to see or refused to see was the figure seated across from him. Jasmine Crockett, too many of the pundits, she was already dismissed. Too fiery, some said. Too blunt, muttered others. They labeled her as emotional, combative, unrefined for the stage of serious debate. The coded language was obvious. She wasn't supposed to fit in these gilded halls. They predicted she would be outmaneuvered, rattled, overshadowed by the Trump legacy. Their analysis betrayed not just condescension, but a willful blindness to the strength that comes from never being handed anything. Because Jasmine Crockett had walked into that room with something Barron could never purchase, never inherit, never fake: legitimacy. Her legitimacy wasn't born of lineage. It was carved out of lived experience, sharpened through years of representing communities that Washington often ignored. She was no stranger to being underestimated, in fact. She had made a career out of turning underestimation into fuel. So when Barron leaned forward in his seat, smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, the audience leaned too. They were expecting the swagger, the bravado, the family flair for turning insults into theater. He didn't disappoint. His opening volley wasn't even subtle. I suppose, Barron said, his voice dripping with inherited disdain. Some people are only here because their districts couldn't find anyone more qualified. The room shifted. It wasn't just an insult, it was a dismissal. He hadn't just questioned her politics, he had questioned her right to even sit at that table. A Trump hallmark. Delegitimize the opponent before the debate begins. Barron thought it was clever. He thought it was sharp. But in reality, it was clumsy arrogance masquerading as wit. Jasmine didn't react. Not yet. She let him speak. Let him bask in his own theatrics. The crowd of loyalists behind him chuckled softly, mistaking cruelty for intelligence. But the cameras caught something the audience missed. The slightest narrowing of Jasmine's eyes. The quiet inhale that always precedes a calculated strike. This wasn't just about her and Barron. The stakes were much higher, written into the fabric of the moment. On one side stood dynasty, the belief that power should be passed like heirlooms, untouchable and unquestioned. On the other stood dignity, the belief that power should be earned, not inherited. That respect comes from service, not surnames. For Barron, this was another performance, another chance to test his father's playbook. For Jasmine, it was something else entirely. It was an opportunity to prove, not just to him, but to the millions watching, that arrogance collapses when confronted with unshakable dignity. The insult Barron threw wasn't just a barb at her. It was a barb at everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong in spaces dominated by wealth and privilege. Every immigrant child whose accent was mocked. Every woman told she was too emotional. Every working class candidate sneered at by pundits who valued polish over authenticity. Jasmine knew she wasn't only answering for herself, she was answering for all of them. And that's where Barron made his fatal mistake. Because in his arrogance, he mistook silence for weakness. He mistook restraint for hesitation. He thought Jasmine's calm meant his jab had landed. He couldn't see that she was only drawing the bowstring tighter, waiting for the perfect moment to release. The audience didn't see it yet either. The pundits scribbled notes, whispering about Barron's confidence, about how Jasmine seemed measured, even quiet. The early headlines were practically writing themselves. Trump air commands the stage. Crockett struggles to respond. They were already drafting their narratives, blind to the storm that was gathering in the silence between Jasmine's breaths. And then, as Barron pressed on, weaving his entitlement into yet another boast about family legacy, the atmosphere began to shift. Those watching closely felt it, the tension tightening, the anticipation mounting. Something was coming. Something sharp enough to pierce through the bulletproof glass of Trumpian arrogance. Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. She had heard worse before, endured sharper dismissals. But this time was different. This wasn't just about defending herself. It was about holding up a mirror to Barron and forcing him to see what everyone else already saw. A boy cloaked in a man's suit, leaning on a name he hadn't earned, trying to lecture someone who had clawed her way into that chamber with nothing but grit and purpose. The silence stretched again, heavy and deliberate, as Jasmine prepared her words. The crowd shifted in their seats, sensing that the dynamic had changed even if they couldn't explain how. The air crackled with anticipation, the kind of electricity that precedes lightning. No one in that room knew it yet. But Barron had just lit the match that would burn down his own argument. Asterisk. Barron Trump had entered the chamber that day not as a participant in dialogue, but as a spectacle. He carried himself the way someone carries a crown they never earned, not with gratitude, but with entitlement. The son of Donald Trump was not just another voice in the room. He was presented as a legacy, a living extension of a brand that had always thrived on spectacle, wealth, and controversy. To him, the setting wasn't intimidating. It was merely another stage where the Trump name was supposed to guarantee dominance. From the beginning, his upbringing was a fortress of privilege. While most young Americans wrestled with student loans, part-time jobs, and uncertain futures, Barron's greatest challenge was whether his private security detail would inconvenience his plans. His world was one of gold-plated hallways, exclusive clubs, and carefully staged photographs. Struggle was not part of his vocabulary. Yet on this day, he wanted to speak as though he knew the struggles of ordinary Americans. He wanted to present himself as an heir to not just wealth, but to wisdom. And that contradiction was the crack in his armor. He postured about toughness, about resilience, about fighting for America. Yet his own life had been insulated from the battles most citizens face daily. He had never stood in line for a paycheck that barely covered rent. He had never been told he didn't belong because of his name or his accent. He had never been dismissed as too emotional or too inexperienced by those who wanted to keep him out. His battles were cosmetic, his hardships curated, and yet, from his perch of privilege, dared to mock the legitimacy of someone who had earned every inch of ground she stood on. The villain in this duel was not an accident. Barron had leaned into the role, perhaps unknowingly, but undeniably. Every smirk, every dismissive glance, every word spoken with that casual condescension reinforced it. He was arrogance embodied, the assumption that lineage equals credibility, that inheritance equals authority. And for a time it worked. For a time, people leaned forward, nodded along, even laughed at his barbs. He had mastered the optics of confidence without understanding the weight of authenticity. What he didn't realize, or perhaps refused to realize, was how fragile that power really was. Confidence built on inheritance is brittle. It lacks the resilience forged by hardship. It lacks the credibility that comes from sacrifice. The Trump name could amplify his voice, but it could not protect him from being outmatched by someone who spoke not from privilege, but from truth. As the cameras rolled, Barron continued to lean into the performance. He recited lines meant to sting, dismissals crafted to wound. To him, it was all sport. A duel where the Trump swagger was supposed to guarantee victory. But behind that veneer, the contradictions grew clearer. He talked about grit, yet his hands were uncalloused. He talked about resilience, yet his own composure cracked when challenged. He talked about America's greatness, yet his only understanding of it came from the view atop a golden tower. And the public could see it. Viewers at home weren't blind to the theater. They saw a boy playing a man's game, relying on his last name to do the heavy lifting. They saw arrogance without depth, performance without principle. They saw someone who believed he could bully his way through, only to find that the opponent across the table wasn't intimidated, wasn't shaken, wasn't about to yield. Every hero needs a villain, and Barron had cast himself perfectly. Not through malice alone, but through the hollow conviction that his dynasty made him untouchable. He was the embodiment of entitlement, meeting accountability, of arrogance, colliding with dignity. And in that collision, he was destined to crack. Because history has never been kind to those who mistake inheritance for invincibility. And in that chamber, under those lights, Barron's contradictions were about to unravel in real time. And that's when Jasmine Crockett stepped forward, bringing with her a story Barron could never match. Jasmine Crockett did not walk into that chamber wrapped in the insulation of wealth or the guarantees of a famous last name. She walked in with something far more formidable, a history of struggle that had carved her character, a track record of standing in the fire and refusing to yield, and a purpose that reached far beyond personal ambition. Hers was not the story of inheritance. It was the story of earning every inch of ground with sweat, grit, and conviction. Long before the cameras ever found her, Jasmine was a lawyer. Not the type whose clients arrived in chauffeured cars or paid retainers large enough to build skyscrapers. Her clients were often those who had nothing, who faced the crushing weight of a justice system stacked against them. She defended the poor, the marginalized, the people whose names never made the headlines. She took on cases that offered little glamour and even less money. Because for her, the law was never about prestige, it was about service. Each trial, each case, each client was a battle against a system that too often silenced the very people it claimed to protect. Activism came naturally to her. Not the performative kind, not the carefully staged photo ops. Real activism. Standing on picket lines, speaking out in rooms where her presence was unwelcome. Demanding accountability from institutions that thrived on opacity. She knew what it felt like to be dismissed, to be underestimated, to be told to sit down when she dared to stand tall. And instead of folding, she sharpened herself against it. Every insult became a blade she forged into armor. Every attempt to push her out only reinforced her determination to stay. her reputation began to precede her. Sharp with facts, devastating in debate, fearless in confrontation. Where others might flinch under attack, Jasmine thrived. She didn't raise her voice because she didn't need to. The strength of her words, the precision of her arguments, and the moral clarity of her convictions did the heavy lifting. She could turn silence into a weapon, a pause into a statement louder than any insult. This was the contrast that defined her. Service against dynasty. Truth against arrogance. Her authority did not come from a name etched onto towers or printed on checks. It came from years of listening to the voiceless, carrying their struggles into spaces that were designed to exclude them, and forcing the powerful to face the realities they preferred to ignore. Barron leaned on a dynasty. Jasmine leaned on dignity. In dignity, history shows, always outlasts arrogance. Her roots deepened that contrast. She knew sacrifice, not as an abstract idea, but as lived experience. Growing up, she watched communities scrape together what they could. Neighbors helping neighbors, when institutions turned their backs. She saw what resilience really looked like. Single mothers juggling 2 jobs. Children working hard not for fame but for the chance to lift their families higher. Immigrants fighting to prove their worth in a country that too often doubted them. Those stories lived in Jasmine's bones. They became the compass that guided her every decision. It's why she connected so deeply with everyday Americans. She wasn't some distant politician speaking in rehearsed platitudes. She spoke the language of lived experience, of hardship and hope intertwined. People saw themselves in her. They saw someone who had walked the same cracked sidewalks, who had felt the same dismissals, who had wrestled with the same barriers. And in her victories, they felt their own. That connection made her dangerous to the entitled. Because when she spoke, she didn't just carry her own voice, she carried the echoes of millions. Barron might have thought he was facing one opponent across the table, but in reality, he was staring into the eyes of every community Jasmine had ever defended. Every individual who had ever been told they didn't belong. Her presence was not just her own. It was collective, amplified, indomitable. This was why she could not be rattled. Insults slid off her because she had already heard worse in courtrooms, in interviews, and the quiet sneers of those who dismissed her. She had already been underestimated 1,000 times and had turned each one into fuel. What Barron mistook for vulnerability was, in fact, restraint. What he assumed was timidity was strategy. And so, when the smirk spread across his face, he leaned forward as though his last name alone gave him the upper hand. Jasmine saw more than arrogance. She saw an opportunity. Not to simply shut him down, but to expose the fragility of inherited power. To show the millions watching that lineage might buy a seat. But it cannot buy legitimacy. She had been preparing for moments like this her entire life. Every trial, every dismissal, every late-night brief filed for clients who couldn't afford another advocate. That had all sharpened her into the kind of figure who didn't just respond to arrogance, but dismantled it. And so when Barron smirked across the microphone, Jasmine already knew her strike would not just land, it would echo. Asterisk. Barron leaned into the microphone with the easy arrogance of someone who had never been told no. His voice carried that smug half-smile, the kind that didn't need to be seen to be felt. The chamber was tense, but he seemed oblivious, or perhaps addicted to the tension he was stirring. "So tell us," he began, his words dripping with mock politeness. "How does someone like you, someone with, let's just say, a light resume, expect to lecture me on American values?" The dig was intentional. He dragged out the pause, letting the insult sink in. Pundits would later say it was a calculated move, a way to frame her as small, illegitimate, unworthy of the stage. But in that moment, it looked less like calculation and more like cruelty dressed up as charm. Asterisk, the crowd stirred. A few smirks flickered on the faces of his allies. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tone had crossed into something sharper, something meaner. Barron thrived on that unease. He pressed forward. Asterisk, because let's be honest, he continued, you wouldn't even be sitting here if not for the generous tolerance of this institution. You don't belong at the same table as leaders, builders, winners. He spat that last word as though it were a title his family owned by birthright. The arrogance ballooned in the air, filling the chamber like smoke. Every syllable was meant to suffocate, to diminish, to remind her of her place as he imagined it below him. And then, just to twist the knife, he smirked. That quiet, cutting smirk that said more than his words ever could. I own this stage. You're just a guest. A murmur rippled through the audience. Some gasped outright. Others lowered their eyes. It wasn't just disrespect. It was entitlement laid bare. Jasmine Crockett sat steady, her face unmoved. No flinch, no visible flicker of anger. She let his words wash over her like waves against a cliff, unshaken. To the untrained eye, she seemed passive. To those who knew her, she was storing the moment. Winding the spring of her reply, the silence after his insult stretched long. Too long? Long enough for Barron to believe he had won this round, that his barbs had struck deep. He leaned back, arms folded, satisfied with the echo of his own voice. And then came the pause. Jasmine leaned forward just slightly. Not rushed, not rattled. The microphone caught her steady breath. Her eyes locked on his, and for the first time in the exchange, the room realized who truly commanded the stage. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm was its own thunder. You know, she began slowly, arrogance is loud. Truth doesn't have to shout. The words sliced through the chamber with surgical precision. No theatrics, no wasted syllables. Just a clean incision. The crowd shifted again, but this time differently. Whispers carried along the rows. Someone let out a low chuckle. The dynamic had tilted almost imperceptibly, but decisively. Barron blinked. Just once. The kind of blink that betrays a sudden crack in confidence. He opened his mouth as if to retort, but Jasmine wasn't done. She let the silence hang just long enough to make him squirm. I've stood across from bullies before, she continued, and I've learned something about them. They mistake cruelty for strength. They think sneers and insults make them untouchable. But every single time arrogance collapses under the weight of truth. The words landed heavy. They weren't just a rebuttal. They were an indictment. Someone in the audience coughed. Others leaned forward, sensing the shift. It wasn't Barron's stage anymore. It was hers. And still, Jasmine wasn't rushing. She was pacing herself like a master storyteller, letting the anticipation coil tighter with each deliberate word. Barron's jaw twitched. He tried to keep his smirk, but it faltered at the edges. He glanced at the cameras, at the audience, searching for reassurance that his dominance held. It didn't. The whispers grew louder. A reporter scribbled furiously. The clip was writing itself, and then she paused again. A pause so intentional it froze the air. You could hear the tension hum like the moment before a storm breaks. Barron leaned forward instinctively, as if bracing himself without even knowing why. Her eyes narrowed. Her tone sharpened not with anger, but with inevitability. And in that charged stillness, she delivered the words that would shatter the chamber, silence the smirks, and send shockwaves far beyond those walls. Then came the 5 words that silenced the chamber. Asterisk for a moment, the chamber was silent. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but charged like the pause before thunder splits the sky. Barron leaned back in his chair, smug and certain. Convinced he had reduced Jasmine Crockett to nothing more than a quiet target for his arrogance, and then, with a calm so deliberate, it cut sharper than any shout. Jasmine leaned forward and spoke. Is Ivanka your mom? 5 words. Simple, clean, lethal. The effect was instantaneous. The air cracked. Gasps burst across the chamber, colliding with scattered laughter, as though the entire room had been waiting for anyone to puncture the bubble of Trumpian arrogance. Some mouths dropped open, stunned. Others covered their faces, torn between disbelief and delight. A ripple of shock and satisfaction rolled through the gallery. It wasn't just an insult. It was a precision strike, because those words carried layers more than even Barron. In that moment, could untangle first the insult, stripping him of his self-constructed aura, reducing the mighty heir to a boy defined by rumor, whispers, and insecurity. The question wasn't even meant to be answered. It was a spotlight turned against him, forcing everyone to stare at what he least wanted, exposed his shaky identity tethered not to his achievements, to gossip and dynasty. Second, the exposure. The irony that a young man standing on his father's stage to sneer about American values had never built a thing without leaning on a last name. "Is Ivanka your mom?" wasn't just ridicule. It was an X-ray. It revealed the fragility of his authority, the cracks in his armor, the hollowness beneath the entitlement. And third, the truth bomb. It crystallized the absurdity of dynastic arrogance. Jasmine didn't need to explain her case point by point. In 5 words, she reduced a dynasty to a punchline. The chamber erupted. Laughter spilled like water breaking through a dam. Even those who tried to contain themselves couldn't hold back the smirks, the stifled chuckles. It was the kind of line destined for replay, destined for remix, destined to live forever in the viral bloodstream of social media. And at the center of it all sat Barron. His smirk collapsed instantly. His face flushed red, climbing from his collar to his temples. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. His lips fumbled, shaping half-syllables that never reached sound. The silence of his failure was louder than any defense he could have mounted. The cameras caught every twitch, every blink, every failed attempt to recover. In cinematic cuts, the scene played out like a duel. One shot. Jasmine, composed, steady, a figure carved in resolve. Next shot. Barron, unraveling, his composure leaking away in real time. Then back to the crowd. Eyes wide, phones already raised, capturing history in shaky clips that would soon explode across timelines. On Twitter, the hashtags began within minutes. Hashtag Ivanka your mom. Hashtag Crockett clapback. Hashtag Barron exposed. The line traveled faster than fire, each replay sparking fresh waves of laughter, awe, and righteous satisfaction. It wasn't just a mic drop. It was an earthquake. But inside that chamber, the most powerful reaction wasn't laughter. It was the silence that followed the eruption. The kind of silence that comes when the balance of power shifts. When everyone in the room realizes they've just witnessed the exact moment the tide turned, Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't grin. She didn't need to. Her power came from restraint. She let the words hang, suspended in the air, resonating longer because she didn't chase them with more. Her face remained calm, her posture steady. A warrior who knew her strike had landed so perfectly that anything else would only dilute it. Barron, meanwhile, shrank. The boy who had swaggered into the chamber with a dynasty at his back suddenly looked small. His shoulders hunched, his gaze dropped. His arrogance dissipated like steam under cold air. He shuffled his papers as if they might offer a shield, but nothing could hide him. Not in that moment, the audience drank it in. This wasn't just political theater, it was a morality play. David had just felled Goliath. Not with a stone, but with a question so devastating it would be replayed for years to come. In that chamber, people weren't just witnesses. They were participants in history. Every gasp, every laugh, every viral clip uploaded from the gallery became part of the legend. And outside, millions more would soon join in. Jasmine's restraint made the contrast sharper. She sat as though nothing monumental had happened, while the world reeled around her. That composure turned her into more than just a congresswoman. In that moment, she was the embodiment of dignity standing against dynasty. Barron's unraveling wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. A boy raised in privilege, handed stages instead of earning them. Undone by a single sentence from a woman he thought he could belittle. The reversal was total. The cameras lingered on him, desperate for any sign of recovery. A retort, a laugh, a shrug, something, but nothing came. Just stammering, fumbling, his face a portrait of collapse, and all the while, Jasmine remained still. The storm had passed through her, not from her. She had become the eye of the moment, calm, centered, immovable. Reporters would later write that it wasn't just a debate, it was an exorcism of arrogance. That 5 words had stripped away the illusion of untouchable power and revealed entitlement for what it was. fragile, brittle, exposed. The satisfaction among her supporters was visceral. This was more than politics. This was vindication. The thrill of seeing justice delivered in real time. Not through policy papers or long speeches, but through a single, unforgettable question. And as the chamber settled, as Barron sat diminished and Jasmine sat unshaken, the moment crystallized into legend. Everyone knew they had witnessed something that would ripple outward, something that would not be contained by walls or minutes or transcripts, because those 5 words were not confined to the chamber. They were already traveling into headlines, into social feeds, and into the hearts of millions who had longed to see arrogance toppled. And that's why the story couldn't end there, because the blast radius of those 5 words would travel far beyond that chamber. By the time the chamber emptied that night, the clip had already begun its second life online. The moment Jasmine Crockett asked, "Is Ivanka your mom?" was no longer confined to a room of politicians. It was racing through the arteries of the internet. It's unstoppable, electric, contagious. On TikTok, edits popped up within minutes. Some slowed the clip to half speed, zooming in on Barron's stunned face as the words landed. Others layered in dramatic sound effects. A record scratch, a nuclear explosion, a bell toll. Memes spread like wildfire, split screens of Jasmine as a calm warrior queen and Barron as a bewildered child caught with no. Twitter has always sharpened the edge. The hashtag IVANKA your mom surged to the top of trending lists before Barron had even left his seat. In its shadow rose another hashtag Crockett truth bomb. For hours, timelines flooded with GIFs, reaction videos, and threads unpacking the deeper meaning of those 5 words. Users wrote, "She didn't just ask a question, she dismantled a dynasty." Others quipped, "Barron entered with Trump swagger." Left with a stepmom scandal, late-night comedy got its hands on the clip before the week was over. Every host had their version. One slowed down the audio to exaggerate Barron's stammering silence afterward. Another did a mock DNA test reveal skit, reading Jasmine's words like the dramatic climax of a soap opera. Audiences roared, the laughter feeding itself, solidifying the moment not just as political theater, but as cultural phenomenon. But the reaction wasn't just laughter. Pundits on news networks, even those normally hostile to Jasmine Crockett, acknowledged the sheer precision of the strike. One conservative commentator admitted through gritted teeth, "Look, I don't agree with her politics, but that was devastating." Barron looked completely unprepared. Another liberal host framed it differently. It wasn't a personal jab, it was a mirror. She forced him to confront what he couldn't explain, that his name, not his merit, is the foundation of his platform. Influencers across platforms seized on the moment. Instagram Reels paired the clip with captions like, "When your privilege collapses in 5 seconds flat, YouTubers produce breakdowns, pausing the footage like sports analysts dissecting a game-winning play." One viral commentator compared it to a boxer's knockout punch. Crockett didn't swing often, but when she did, it was clean, it was perfect, and it left him on the floor. Even some political opponents, those who had dismissed Crockett before, offered grudging respect. A senior senator remarked, "I may not agree with her ideology, but you cannot deny her command of the moment. She's sharper than people give her credit for." That acknowledgement alone sent ripples. Suddenly, Crockett wasn't just a representative. She was a figure everyone had to take seriously. And the fallout for Barron. Brutal headlines painted him as shaken, silenced, exposed. Editorial cartoons exaggerated his deer-in-headlights expression, freezing him forever in that moment of collapse. Hashtags turned his name into shorthand for fragility. Hashtag Barron Ed began trending. Used anytime someone crumbled under pressure, what stung most wasn't just the ridicule. It was the narrative shift. For months, Barron had been framed by his allies as the future of the Trump legacy, the confident heir stepping into the arena. Overnight, that image shattered. Instead, he became the symbol of everything hollow about inherited power, an emblem of dynasty crumbling in real time. The ripple effects reached further than anyone expected. High school students started using Jasmine's line in debates, laughing as teachers tried to keep order. College campuses turned it into slogans on posters, painted on walls. Is Ivanka your mom? Half meme, half political rallying cry. Protesters carried signs with the phrase "outside Trump rallies," weaponizing humor against arrogance, and in households across the country. People replayed the clip not just for laughter, but for relief. Relief that someone, finally, had punctured the aura of untouchability. That in a world where dynasties seemed invincible, a single voice could still cut through and remind everyone that truth and dignity had. Power social scientists even weighed in, analyzing why the line hit so hard. One noted, it combined humor with truth, ridicule with revelation. That's why it spread. It wasn't just a joke. It was a cultural judgment. Another remarked it tapped into a hunger for accountability. People are tired of arrogance parading as authority. Crockett gave them a release valve. Everywhere you turned, the clip lived. On talk radio, in podcasts, and late-night bar conversations, the words became shorthand for facing down power. To some, it was comedy. To others, it was catharsis. To many, it was a rallying cry. But beneath the laughter, beneath the memes, something deeper was at work. Jasmine Crockett's strike wasn't just viral, it was transformative. It shifted how people saw her, how they measured him, how they weighed the meaning of earned respect against inherited privilege. And as the storm swelled, one truth became clear. This wasn't going to fade like yesterday's news cycle. This was going to stick. It was going to be remembered. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't simply embarrassed Barron Trump. She had branded him. She had shown in real time the fragility of dynasty when faced with dignity. The world laughed. The world applauded. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Because as unforgettable as her question was, it wasn't the end. It was the setup. The viral moment was only the opening act of something larger, something lasting. And that's when she leaned in once more, ready to turn a 5-second clapback into a timeless lesson. Asterisk. It's never just about names, she said, her voice calm, deliberate, almost gentle against the tension that still lingered. This country wasn't built to be passed down like a crown. America doesn't belong to dynasties. It belongs to people who serve, who sacrifice, who show up even when it's hard. That's the lesson my parents taught me. That's the lesson too many in this room seem to have forgotten. The words cut deeper than any insult. Because they weren't aimed at Barron anymore. They were aimed at the illusion he represented. His arrogance was just the latest mask worn by entitlement, and Crockett ripped it off in front of everyone. She reframed the moment. No longer was it about a son of a president being embarrassed by a sharp line. It was about a principle older than the family named Trump, older than any dynasty. That dignity is earned, not inherited. That leadership comes from service, not from bloodline. The chamber grew still, the audience sensing the shift. What had been comedy was becoming something heavier, more profound. Crockett was transforming a viral spark into a universal fire. You see, she continued, you can mock people like me all you want, call us unqualified, call us loud, call us inconvenient. But what you can't erase is the truth. I didn't walk in here with a famous last name. I walked in here with work, with sacrifice, with the voices of people who never had a seat at this table until now. And no amount of arrogance can change that. Her voice rose, not in volume, but in resonance. Every word carried weight, the kind that travels past headlines and enters memory. She didn't need to name Barron anymore. He sat, small and silent, a cautionary tale in real time. The target had shifted. This wasn't about him, it was about what he stood for, and why that facade would always collapse against someone rooted in purpose. Outside, millions were watching, and they heard something bigger than a clapback. They heard a creed. Crockett's words reframed their own frustrations, their own sense of being dismissed, overlooked, belittled. She had turned one boy's arrogance into a mirror for the arrogance of systems, of dynasties, of inherited privilege everywhere, asterisk. And people felt seen, because the truth she spoke wasn't just about politics, it was about life in America. It was about the factory worker whose name doesn't open doors but whose sweat builds the foundation of towns. It was about the immigrant whose accent draws ridicule, but whose hands plant the seeds of tomorrow. It was about every young person told they don't belong. Every woman underestimated, every family ignored. Crockett gave them a voice. She gave them validation. She turned a meme into a movement of recognition. The emotional crescendo came not with fire, but with dignity. She leaned in, her tone almost conversational now, yet amplified by the silence in the chamber. "America isn't about surnames," she said. "It's about service. It's about standing up when it's easier to sit down. It's about showing courage when the world tells you to be quiet. And if you believe otherwise, if you believe this democracy is some inheritance for the privileged few, then you don't understand the very country you claim to represent." Asterisk, the words hit harder than the joke, because they revealed the heart of the matter. It was never just about who could land the sharpest insult, it was about who could remind the nation of its soul. And in that chamber at that moment, Jasmine Crockett did exactly that. Asterisk. Commentators would later call it her defining pivot, the instant she elevated a viral clip into a timeless lesson. Late-night hosts replayed the insult, but pastors and Sunday sermons echoed her moral. Civil rights leaders quoted her line about service, weaving it into rallies and speeches. Teachers printed it, taped it to classroom walls, telling students, "This is what America means." What Crockett accomplished was rare. She bridged the divide between entertainment and enlightenment, between the meme and the message. The world tuned in for the drama, but they stayed for the dignity. And as she finished, her final words echoed not just through the chamber, but across living rooms, across feeds, across hearts hungry for something real. "This isn't about me, and it isn't even about him. This is about us, all of us. And as long as I have a voice, I will use it to remind America of what it can still be, a place where arrogance falls and dignity endures." The sentence hung in the air, heavy and luminous, a closing note that didn't end but reverberated. People would quote it for weeks. Protesters would chant it. Supporters would hold it up on placards. And even her critics, though they wouldn't admit it, knew in their bones they had witnessed a moment that couldn't be undone. The dust settled. The chamber exhaled. And one truth became clear: arrogance falls, but dignity endures. Asterisk, is Ivanka your mom? 5 words. A question on the surface, but in truth, a scalpel slicing through arrogance, privilege, and the fragile armor of dynasty. It wasn't just a jab at Barron Trump. It wasn't gossip. It wasn't tabloid fodder. It was the kind of question that strips away all pretense, leaving only raw truth exposed. Because at its core, that line wasn't about family secrets or rumors. It was about something far bigger. It was about power, about entitlement, about the audacity of a boy standing on a stage not because he had earned it, but because his surname had delivered him there, and Jasmine Crockett knew it. That's why the chamber fell silent. That's why the internet exploded. That's why even days later, people were still repeating those words. "Is Ivanka your mom?" became more than a viral hashtag. It became a mirror, forcing people to see the ugly shadow of dynasty politics, where arrogance often speaks louder than merit. And in that mirror, America was reminded of something essential. This country was never meant to be ruled by bloodlines. It was meant to be served by those who stand for truth, justice, and dignity. Crockett didn't just win a debate that day. She reminded everyone watching, from lawmakers to late-night hosts to everyday citizens scrolling through TikTok, that courage can be quiet, sharp, and devastatingly effective. She reminded us that real strength doesn't need to shout. It just needs to speak the truth, once, with clarity. And Barron, he was left small, diminished. A symbol not of strength, but of entitlement, collapsing under its own weight. History will not remember the specifics of his taunts, his careless arrogance, his smugness, but it will remember the moment he was silenced, not by volume, not by rage, but by 5 carefully chosen words. That's the story. That's the lesson. That arrogance falls, but dignity endures. So here's the call to you, the viewer, the listener, the witness of this clash. If you believe dignity must always speak louder than dynasty, share this story. If you believe truth should always outshine arrogance, subscribe for more moments where justice wins and entitlement crumbles. Because stories like this aren't just entertainment. They're reminders that power doesn't belong to the loudest voice, or the wealthiest name, or the most powerful family. It belongs to those who dare to stand steady, calm, and unshaken in the face of arrogance. As Crockett walked out of that chamber, steady, unflinching, her words echoing across the country. One image remained: Barron Trump, left behind, small in the spotlight. The weight of dynasty no longer a shield, but a burden too heavy to carry. And as the dust settled, one truth became clear: arrogance falls, but dignity endures.